You think you know this story. A boy with a face the world wasn't ready for. A mother who refused to apologize for who she was. A Hollywood movie that made America cry into their popcorn. You've seen the posters. Maybe you've seen Cher in that leather jacket. Maybe you cried at the ending. But here's the thing about stories that get turned into movies. The version that reaches the screen is never the whole truth. And in the case of Rocky Dennis and his mother Rusty, the gap between the movie and reality is wider, stranger, and far more honest than anything a Hollywood script could hold. Before she died, Florence Rusty Tullis, the real woman behind the Cher performance, the real mother behind the legend, spoke openly. She gave interviews. She sat with reporters. She said things that were inconvenient, uncomfortable, and completely in character for a woman who had never once in her life told people what they wanted to hear. And what she said about her son, about the film, about the night Rocky died, and about the philosophy she raised him on, it changes the story entirely. So let's talk about what she actually said, because most people have never heard any of it. Roy Lee Dennis came into the world on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California. His mother called him Rocky because as a baby, he would only sleep if someone rocked him. For the first couple of years, he was just a kid who caught more than his share of colds and ear infections, nothing that suggested what was coming. Then, around age 2, he went in for a routine tonsillectomy, and the X-ray technician noticed something unusual about the shape of his skull. What followed was nearly a year of visits to UCLA Medical Center, multiple appointments every single week, until the diagnosis finally arrived: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, a condition so rare that in 1965, when Rusty first heard those words, doctors told her only 6 other documented cases existed in the entire recorded history of medicine. 6 in the world. The disease causes abnormal calcium deposits to build up inside the skull. The bones thicken and expand outward, distorting the face, compressing the brain, gradually destroying vision, hearing, and neurological function. The doctors gave Rusty the prognosis without softening it. Her son would likely go blind, probably suffer intellectual disability, and would almost certainly be dead before his 7th birthday. Rusty Dennis did not react the way those doctors expected. She did not collapse. She did not quietly accept the timeline they handed her. She pushed back, not in a dramatic, movie-worthy speech, but in the slow, grinding, daily way that actually matters. She fought schools that tried to move Rocky out of mainstream classrooms. She dismissed doctors who insisted his eyesight was too poor for him to read. She told anyone who tried to limit her son that they were confusing their own discomfort with medical fact. And Rocky responded to that. He thrived in ways that had no medical explanation. He developed warmth, humor, and an almost unsettling emotional intelligence. He tutored other students for $3 an hour, a rate he negotiated himself. He memorized constellations. He graduated junior high as an honor student after starting behind academically. He was voted friendliest camper. He fell in love at summer camp with a girl who was blind and therefore could not see his face, and he apparently found that quietly perfect. When a surgeon offered to operate and alter his features, Rocky asked a single question: who would he see in the mirror if he changed his face? He chose to keep it. That was the boy Rusty raised. But to understand what Rusty said before she died, you first have to understand who Rusty actually was. Because the real woman was significantly more complicated than Cher's performance, as good as that performance was. Florence Tullis was born in Brooklyn on May 29th, 1936, the daughter of a truck driver, Jewish, sharp-tongued, and apparently incapable of doing anything conventional way. By 13, she had been expelled from junior high for truancy. By 14, she was smoking marijuana and spending her time around motorcycle gangs. At 15, she dropped out of school entirely and took a job as a dancer at Coney Island. She was younger than the legal driving age. She married her first husband, a truck driver named Tommy Mason, at 17. They had a son, Joshua, before that marriage fell apart. Then came her second marriage, to Roy Dennis, a move to California, and in 1961, Rocky. Rusty was a full member of a motorcycle gang called the Turks. Not a girlfriend of a member, not someone who hung around, a member. These were hard-living, fiercely loyal people, and they built a world around Rocky that the film actually captured reasonably well, even if it softened the edges. The character played by Sam Elliott, Scar, was based on a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's longtime partner. That entire circle of bikers wasn't background color. They were Rocky's family. They loved him without conditions and without pity, which was exactly what he needed. And Rusty's drug use. She addresses directly, and the distinction she drew matters. The movie framed her drug use as something born of struggle, a woman overwhelmed by her circumstances reaching for something to dull the pain. Rusty rejected that framing completely. She said plainly that she partied all the time and that drugs were part of the partying lifestyle. That's not the same thing as a woman drowning and grabbing a life raft. That's a woman who made choices and owned them. The difference mattered to her, and it should matter to anyone trying to understand who she actually was. Now, the movie Mask was released in 1985, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, with Cher as Rusty and Eric Stoltz as Rocky. It earned over $48 million at the box office. Rusty Dennis received $15,000 for the rights to her life and her dead son's story. $15,000. And according to multiple sources, most of that money went directly to medical bills for her older son Joshua, who had been diagnosed with AIDS. She didn't sell Rocky's story for profit or recognition. She sold it to try to keep another son alive. When reporters showed up expecting gratitude and tears, what they got instead was Rusty being exactly herself. She called the film a fairy tale, not a tribute, not a love letter to Rocky, a fairy tale. She told the Chicago Tribune in 1986 that she had always believed showing Rocky's courage could help disabled children and their parents, and that sometimes the parents are more disabled than their kids. But she admitted she hadn't anticipated the film becoming so much about her. She was generous about Cher's performance, genuinely so. She told the Tribune that Cher had depicted her very well, and then she added, in a line that captures her entire personality in about 12 words, "I always thought I was perfectly normal. The rest of the world is nuts." That's Rusty Dennis. That's the whole woman in a sentence. But she also pointed out the film's factual departures clearly and without any attempt to let them slide. The movie compressed more than a decade of events into what appears to be roughly a year. And her older son Joshua, Rocky's brother, was written out of the film entirely. He simply doesn't exist in the movie version of events. That omission bothered her. Joshua was real. Joshua was part of Rocky's life, and Hollywood had erased him as if he'd never existed. Then there was the music. Rocky Dennis loved Bruce Springsteen. Not casually, devotedly. Director Peter Bogdanovich had built the film's entire soundtrack around Springsteen's music specifically because of that. Then Universal Pictures couldn't finalize a deal with Columbia Records, and they quietly swapped all of it out for Bob Seger tracks without informing Bogdanovich. When Rusty was asked about this on a San Francisco talk show in 1985, she delivered one of the most precise, quietly devastating lines imaginable. She said she didn't think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. That was it. She didn't rage about it or launch into a long complaint. She just said that one thing, and everyone in that studio understood exactly what it meant. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue Universal for $19 million over the switch. The Springsteen tracks weren't restored until a director's cut DVD came out in 2004, nearly 20 years after the film first hit theaters. Now here's the part that nobody really talks about, what Rusty said about the night Rocky died, and what it reveals about the philosophy she had built her entire approach to motherhood on. By September 1978, Rocky was 16 years old, and the disease had finally begun to overtake him. He was using a wheelchair in his final weeks. The headaches that had been part of his life since childhood had escalated beyond anything medication could reach. On the evening of October 2nd, the family, Rocky, Rusty, Bernie, the biker circle, went out to dinner together. Everyone could see how diminished he had become. That night, Rocky came home with a headache. Rusty did what she had done throughout his entire life whenever the pain came. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He went to sleep. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died the following morning at home, quietly, in his sleep, 16 years old and nearly 17. Almost a full decade past the death sentence doctors had handed his mother when he was 2. The movie shows Rusty discovering his body herself, a raw and shattering scene. In reality, she wasn't home when it happened. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge. Her partner Bernie called her. The film smoothed that out, turned into a cleaner grief, a more cinematic moment of discovery. The reality was messier and more human, and somehow more honest for it. What Rusty said about her parenting philosophy, the belief that a person can make themselves well if they choose to, is worth sitting with carefully. She never described it as a failure. She never framed it as something she regretted. She stated, plainly and repeatedly, that she believed in it completely, that she had applied it to Rocky from infancy, and that she felt it had given him something medicine couldn't: the absolute refusal to see himself as someone who was dying. Whether that belief also meant his pain was sometimes minimized, whether there were moments where he needed something other than being sent to his room, those are questions only Rocky and Rusty could have answered. What the record confirms is that she never backed away from it. She believed that what she had given him was not denial, but defiance. And looking at the life Rocky actually lived, the honors, the friendships, the love, the quiet dignity of the choice he made about his own face, it becomes genuinely difficult to argue that she was entirely wrong. Joshua Mason, Rusty's firstborn son, and the brother Hollywood erased, deserves to be part of this story. In 1985, he was a writer living in San Francisco. A year later, he was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, the cancer strongly associated with AIDS at the height of that crisis. He was openly gay, and he described his mother as supportive, even if she sometimes handled it in classically Rusty fashion, at one point suggesting a sperm bank, so she might still get grandchildren. Joshua died in 1987 at 32 years old. Rusty had now lost both of her sons. In an interview around that time, she said that Joshua didn't believe in dying. She said she didn't either. She never asked why. Not for Rocky, not for Joshua, not for herself. After Rocky died, Rusty moved to San Francisco and converted to Buddhism. She worked as a counselor with people struggling with addiction. She had plans to work with the Shawnee Project, which at that time was focused on supporting people dying from AIDS. The woman who had spent her youth in chaos was, by the mid-1980s, building something deliberate and quiet out of everything she had survived. She still rode motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Rusty, then going by Florence Tullis, was riding her three-wheel motorcycle when the right tire came off. She lost control, struck a curb, and her body slammed into a telephone pole. For a period afterward, nobody knew. Friends and family had no idea what had happened until a brief item in a local paper mentioned an unidentified 70-year-old woman injured in a motorcycle accident. They put it together and found her. She had broken both legs and punctured a lung. She survived the crash itself. Of course she did, because she was Rusty Dennis. But the infection that followed was a thing she couldn't fight off. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. She died exactly the way she had lived, moving on her own terms, unable to stop. The screenwriter who wrote Mask, Anna Hamilton Phelan, said it most plainly. Rusty was not the PDA Mother of the Year, but she was the perfect mother for Rocky. You can read that as a compliment or a complication, or the kind of truth that refuses to be one or the other. What the record shows is a boy who lived nearly a decade past his expiration date, who chose his own face, who loved fiercely and was loved back the same way, and who died at home, in his sleep, without machines, without indignity, exactly as his mother had promised he would. And a woman who sold her dead son's story not for fame, but to try to save her other son, who called the resulting film a fairy tale without bitterness, who praised the actress who played her while correcting the record, and who went her own grave still insisting that death was simply somewhere else to go. That's the real story, not the fairy tale. The actual one, messy, sharp-edged, and far more worth knowing.